So thank you all for joining us from Chevalier's books, or at least virtually. My name is Katie. I'm the manager at Chevalier's, and I am pleased to be here tonight representing the oldest independent bookstore in Los Angeles. And I'm also really excited as a baseball fan to get to hear about Cheated tonight. But before we get started, I have just a few pieces of business for everyone. The first thing is that we record all of our events. So that means two things. One, you'll be able to watch this later on YouTube. And it also means that during the course of the evening, if you don't want your picture to possibly show up on our YouTube channel, keep your camera off and take that into consideration when it's question time. The second thing is that there will be question time, and you can put questions into the chat throughout the evening. And when we get to Q&A, I'll be reading those and moderating the chat. And then finally, I'm gonna throw this into the chat here in a second. You can buy copies of tonight's book from Chevalier's, and Andy sent signed book plates, so you can get a signed copy from us. So that will go in the chat as soon as I'm not talking and trying to remember my words so that I can type instead. So I am thrilled to have joining us tonight the author of tonight's book. Wait, here we go. Andy Martino. He is a reporter. He's covered the MLB for a decade, and he is currently at the SNY network in New York. And in conversation with him from LA's very own Los Angeles Times is Dylan Hernandez. And I am thrilled to get to hear the two of them talk, and I will now let them at it.
Right. Well, Andy, first of all, congratulations on getting the book written. You know, I know we talked when you were just kind of starting this out. So, you know, really proud to read this book, and, you know, what a fine work it is. You know,
well, thank you. And thank you to everybody, all of you who are coming to talk about it. And thanks to Dylan, obviously, for being willing to be here. For those of you who don't know, just read Dylan in the paper. He's actually a very nice person. And he's was a very supportive friend through the process, and continues to be tonight. So glad to be here with you.
You know, and just to kind of start here, I think, you know, one thing that I kind of want to mention, I've mentioned this to you, Andy, but, you know, there are people who write about baseball and there are people who cover baseball, you know, and I think that there are a lot of people that write about it, meaning that they write fiction basically. And, you know, it's kind of this kind of idealized version of, you know, what kind of fans think and what teams want you to hear and stuff. And I think, you know, that they're right, kind of the elite reporters, so to speak, are the people that are able to kind of get to know, right, a lot of the personalities and kind of the complexities. And that's what I really liked about this book, is just kind of, you're able to kind of see this again, kind of from like a very kind of human being standpoint, right? How this all unfolded and stuff. You know, obviously, so being here in LA, let's just get like right to the question that everybody wants to know. Did the Astros cheat the Dodgers in the 2017 World Series?
Yes, they did. It's a fact. And look, this is one of those things that was a little bit wishy-washy through the whole investigative process. In his defense, Commissioner Rob Manfred, in his report and issued in early 2020 about, you know, after this investigation of the Astros, said that there was compelling evidence that the Astros continued their cheating scheme, meaning a monitor showing a live feed of the catcher's hands to decode the signs behind the dugout, and a trash can next to the monitor to bang generally for an off-speed pitch. The report said that there was compelling evidence that happened during the 2017 postseason. The issue got muddled up just a little bit when we were covering spring training that year. Manfred gave a news conference and he said there was compelling evidence that there was cheating going on in that World Series, and also contradictory evidence. He found the evidence more compelling than it was. So it was a little bit, well, which is it? And then Carlos Correa, the Astros shortstop, fervently denied. He pulled Ken Rosenthal of Fox and MLB Network out of the clubhouse one day, if I recall, in spring training, and gave this impassioned interview about how they couldn't possibly have cheated in the postseason because he's breaking down at bats. If you look at this little dribbler back to the mound and this throwing error, and that was on a fastball. So there was a lot of noise around whether or not they actually did it in the postseason. And I think that the public imagination kind of chalked that up to, oh, we may never know. As I'm reporting this book, it was one of the last things that fell into place, because I was told from people who were there that it had happened. But when I was honestly, Dylan, when I was reading over the draft, it was like, this is not solid enough for me just to say, oh, sources say it happened. I didn't feel like that would be any more compelling. So I had to really lean on a source towards the very end of this process and say, you have to help me understand exactly how they pulled this off. And I remember the conversation with this source, because I said, the only thing I can imagine with all the MLB officials and all the reporters around is that you guys mounted that TV behind the dugout on the wall, right like in the first inning as games were starting through the World Series, and took it down like in the ninth inning. And I remember this source going, yeah, you got it. Okay. And like hanging up on me. And, I was able to confirm that, like, yep, it happened during the World Series, and that's that.
What do you make of this whole contention of like, well, it might have helped, it might have not helped? What is your, as you research this whole thing, what's your assessment of how much of a difference this stuff made?
Two things about that. I remember when Correa was making those points about how, hey, we scored the run and it was a throwing error. So how could that be the result of sign stealing? That's one thing. And the answer to that, I ran that by baseball people, the rank and file front office guys and scouts that we talk to all the time. And I got like, please, you were able to hit that little comebacker that resulted in the throwing error, probably because you knew a changeup was coming 2 pitches earlier, say, and that changes the complexion of the whole at bat. So it's not just the pitch that you made on contact, it's the whole at bat that's impacted by the fact that you had the signs. And it's also, if you want to look at the ethical calculation, it's kind of like whether it worked or not, whether, some guys said to me, and perhaps credibly, Minute Maid Park with the roof closed is so loud during a postseason game, there's no way you could hear someone getting an audible of the sign to you. And to that you say, well, that may be true in some cases, but you're still trying to cheat. So, there's no way to prove that that's why they won the World Series. But as you know, covering it, the Dodgers won that series, the Astros won that series, by the razor's edge. So certainly cheating through 7 games, or at least the home games, you wonder if that tilted it. Whether it did or not, though, it's the same ethics, right?
Yeah, and I always kind of think too, people, like that try to kind of downplay like this, for example, like the steroid stuff, right? Well, you still need to make contact with the ball, whatever, kind of the same arguments. It's like, okay, well, if that's the case, then why do you do it, right? I mean, if you're going through all this trouble, right? Yeah, of like, mounting a thing and bringing it down and stuff. I wanted to run this quote by you from Andre Ethier, right? So this was in February 2020. So his longtime Dodger, beloved Dodger, so his career ended Game 7 of that 27 World Series, and so the following spring I kind of caught up with him, and before we got into anything, he says like, hey, let's back up here for a second. This is all a byproduct of analytics. And he wanted to kind of get in, he wanted to kind of explain, for example, that like, look, like these analytics departments, they give you data, they'll tell you, say on a 2-1 count, this guy's going to throw a slider 70% of the time. Well, what if that doesn't produce results, right? You're going to keep finding ways to, try to increase the percentage of being right, of being able to, and at some point they found a way to be 100% right, perhaps, right? And, again, one thing I thought you did a really nice job of was kind of introducing the Jeff Lunau character and how that kind of gradually took over, and how he kind of set the tone for that organization and what they were about. Could you talk a little bit about, I know we're not supposed to ask questions like that, but
that's the talk about for those, right? When us print guys and the broadcaster says, talk about. Now we go,
yeah. But you got into Lunau's background, and just how that influenced the way, the organization's culture.
Right, and it's a great point by Ethier to put that on it's the when analytics goes down an evil thread, for lack of a better term, and goes on a bad path, that's the ultimate end of it. Because when Jeff Luhnow got into baseball, he's a consultant from the highly controversial firm McKinsey. He comes from the business world. McKinsey is known to be efficiency based. They have this up or out mentality where there's a pressurized system where either you're promoted or you're out at a certain point. And there's an amorality to a lot of the work they do around the world, which has nothing to do with sports, but it says something about the coldness that analytics can take on if it's in the wrong hands. And he was brought into baseball by Bill DeWitt, the St. Louis Cardinals owner initially, who was literally looking for his own Moneyball guy in the year or two after Moneyball was a bestseller. That was a very trendy thing in baseball, as you know, at that time. Everyone wanted a Billy Bean. The Oakland A's were trendy. Luhnow is that guy in St. Louis, but he in many ways is innovative and brilliant, and the people that like him even like him socially, say he's personable. But the traditionalists and the scouts and even the general manager and the manager in the Cardinals organization saw him as a guy that lacked any respect for tradition, any respect for the ways that players used to be scouted, the ways things used to work, where he would just go in and say, he'd go to a scout and say, well, you can't tell me anything I don't know from these high-speed cameras. And just being very even socially disrespectful about these things. He brought that to Houston. I think it created a culture where they were pursuing technology. They were pursuing innovation. They didn't have respect for traditions of the game. For example, the tradition that might have said you can steal signs from second base with your eyes, but it's not cool to do it with external devices like cameras. There was no respect given to why things were the way they were in the game for a long time. And we never should do things just because they always have been that way. But obviously, a certain amount of understanding of the way things have been is probably a better way to enter an industry. And a player like Ethier could see that coldness coming into the game over the course of his entire career. Well, he broke in with the Dodgers, like 08, 07, 08, around that time?
06, I think. 06,
okay, right.
07,
Yeah, he was on the
somewhere
06 team. So he's actually a player from Ned Colletti to Andrew Friedman, right? A huge sea change in the industry. So he can see how it becomes colder. And one end of that could be anything for a win. Hey, if we're going to have to, steal signs electronically, that could be part of the amoral aspect of that mentality.
Something else Ethier brought up in this interview was the fact that the Dodgers did use video, he said, to figure out sign sequences before the games, right? Mm-hmm. And they would use that information, and if somebody were on second base, then they would relay to that to the plate. Now, from somebody from the outside might kind of look at that and say, well, what's really like the difference? Right? How is this like so terrible and this totally okay?
Well, there's some Astros still saying that. So what's the big deal? And I think in fairness to the Astros, it was maybe my most important job here to figure out if they were just the team that got caught, or if they were if they're the worst offender, or if there was a whole era. And the answer is a little bit of both. But it was, as one head of baseball operations for a team said to me when I was reporting this, look, a lot of us were in shades of gray. I think you could describe what Ethier, you just quoted Ethier, is describing as a shade of gray, using electronics to get signs to base runners, to batters. But there's something about banging on the trash can or putting electronic flashing lights in the scoreboard, which the Yankees believe that they did 2 years later, or drilling a massage gun into a dugout to create a vibration to get a pitch to a coach who's sitting on the other side of the wall. Things like that just don't pass the smell test of ethics, I think, where if your child walked around the corner and saw you doing it with the bat in your hand to hit the garbage can, you'd be like, whereas if you're standing at second base and you get a sign, that has been going on literally since the 19th century. And that is a tradition. And the Red Sox were caught doing that with an Apple Watch in 2017. No question, teams like the Brewers, the Dodgers, and others were credibly accused or even admitted, in this case, to doing things like that. Yasmani Grandal, the former Dodger catcher, had a quote that didn't get a lot of play, but a year or so ago was saying basically the same thing. Sure, we got together and looked at the TV screen and decoded the signs and figured out a way to get that to players in the game. But having a runner on second base is a really big ethical difference within the confines of the game, as you know, Dylan. And there's still some cleverness to that. A runner on second's got to do something. There's an indicator like rubbing your chest to get it to the batter. The batter's got to touch the brim of his helmet, whether he wants it or not. The base runner takes a step to his right or his left to say what kind of pitch it is or the location. There's an art to that that's a little bit more charming than just the here, let me bang on a can for the sign.
Yeah, and I think, right, those of us that have covered the game for a long time, I think one of the things that we like about it is kind of the soul of the game, so to speak, right?
Mhm.
The kind of the conversations, the human aspect of it, and some of these dark arts, so to speak, are kind of part of that tradition, right? I mean, we don't,
Yeah.
even stuff like George Brett's pine tar thing, we kind of look at it with a certain like fondness, right? And I think part of it was that there was an art kind of to that thing. Where do you think that it crosses that line again of going from, you know, kind of this artsy gamesmanship, right? There are a lot of players that I think that are admired, that are Hall of Famers that probably, not just broke the rules, but kind of were the Johnny Appleseeds of this stuff and helped spread ideas on how to cheat.
Right.
Right. And these are some of the most revered figures in the game.
Yeah,
And
well, you're right that there's always been that level of how close can we push gamesmanship to out and out cheating in so many different areas of the game. It's funny, on sign stealing, I found that there's been for more than 100 years a really clear answer to that. There's a quote in the introduction of the book of which is Ty Cobb, saying, "If you can use your eyes on the field of play to figure out signs, that's fine." I'm paraphrasing this, of course. But he said, if you use external devices, which at the time meant like telescopes or spy glasses and mean cameras now, then that's cheating. And that's been a pretty consistent belief. So then with the Astros, you had guys that basically got good at one thing and crossed over to the other, namely Alex Cora, the bench coach of the 2017 Astros, former Dodger, of course. When he was with the Dodgers, even as a young kid, one of the smartest players in the game, and Carlos Beltran, who was the DH on that Astros team, obviously Hall of Fame caliber player for many teams. These guys spent their whole career being clever enough to figure out tiny tips and tells. Like the pitcher flared his glove out this much, so that means he's about to throw a changeup because he just changed his grip. Or, I'm standing at second base and I figure out what the catcher means with all those crazy sign sequences and I can get that to the batter. These guys are doing that in the way that Ty Cobb said was okay for many, many years. They get to Houston into Jeff Lunau's organization, which is, as we discussed earlier, defined by an amorality that even was, I think, unique for this sport, which can be awfully amoral overall, but unique, even take it to an extreme in that way. Access to technology that was new, high-speed cameras, an instant replay room that was still less than a half a decade old. And the whole idea of instant replay is new in baseball, providing the actual feed and the TV screens to look at. So you take Cora and Beltran and you put them in this environment with this technology and that leadership. And so you have individuals who did it the way that's socially accepted and then crossed over to the way that it isn't.
One thing I really loved about the book was, clearly you spent a lot of time in a clubhouse, right? And, fans, I think a lot of times on the outside will think like, well, these are all my guys. They're all great guys and they're all pulling in one direction. And it's never quite like that, right? You have your lazy players, you have your dumb players, you have your guys, really selfish players. And, one thing that I think, again, you did a really great job of was, kind of talking about how Beltran ended up in this position, how a guy like Cora ends up in this position, even Hinch, how he ended up under those kind of particular set of circumstances. Could you kind of describe Beltran's kind of evolution as a guy who kind of broke into the league, maybe as kind of quiet a guy and kind of evolved into this guy who, honestly, as I'm reading this, I'm thinking is, wow, a great leader. Like I would hire this man.
Well, it's funny, the line, this is where ethics gets so interesting and leadership is interesting. And I felt like the concept of leadership was on my mind in a bunch of different ways when I was writing this, because the line between being a great leader, as he actually was and is, could be, I think, between being a cheater is so fine, because as a guy who was good at figuring this stuff out that I just described, he wanted to teach younger Astros players how to do it. It's passing on oral traditions that have been passed on from one generation to the next. And it's one of the things that is, as you said, is beautiful about baseball. It's the soul of the game. And he wanted to pass on that knowledge. He's a fierce advocate for players from Latin America. He was the one who forced the union and teams to create a program where teams had to hire a Spanish language translator, which unbelievably happened in 2015 or 16 in history of baseball. The fact that you remember it was like 6 years ago that it was like the bullpen catcher was the guy who spoke Spanish, so he had to translate for $1 million athlete, or maybe you had to translate sometimes, Dylan, for the other reporters.
No, I
Really.
monopolized those guys
Or
completely.
you used it to your advantage, which was smart as a reporter. Anything you can get. But you know what I'm saying? Beltran advocated for something like that, for player rights. He wanted to teach players traditions. And they actually got started on this high-tech stuff because he was using something called an edgertronic camera, which takes photos at 1,000 frames a second to help young hitters study their swings. And there was one day, and this is key, their instant replay room was down the hall, down a set of stairs, up another set of stairs. Most teams, it was behind the dugout. So Beltran was like, I want to go over video with these guys during games. He and Alex Cora go to the front office, say, can we get a video annex that's closer to our dugout? And they actually used it to look at that edgertronic camera, which is legal. But what you could do is type in an IP address that would bring in a live feed from center field, and there you had the signs. So you see how close the legit and the illegitimate are commingling there. And that's how it happened with Beltran.
Yeah, and Cora's another guy that I find like kind of like a fascinating figure in this, right? I mean, and a lot of teams will have these kind of guys that aren't stars on the team,
Yeah.
yet kind of get this, right? They become kind of these big parts of the clubhouse culture. And what I always find like admirable about these guys, I always imagine being a professional athlete to be, if you're Clayton Kershaw, okay, whatever, right? But most of these guys are kind of year to year. Some kid is coming up trying to take your position, and yet you have a guy like Cora who again becomes a leader and a mentor to other players like this. What is kind of, I mean, right? What I guess the qualities that he had as a player, what helped him become a successful bench coach, do you think, and later a successful manager?
Yeah, similar to Beltran in that he loved teaching and mentoring. When he was with Boston, he was with the Dodgers a while, briefly in Cleveland, and then settled in with the Red Sox for a while, and had been a starting player for a lot of the time he was with the Dodgers. So it was kind of more accustomed to that. And he gets to Boston, and they have not as much of an opportunity for playing time for him. They had two middle infielders, Julio Lugo, who they gave a lot of money to, a guy who was free agent at that time, at short, and Dustin Pedroia emerging at second. And Cora ends up mentoring both of them, which ultimately assures that he will be out of a job at some point. But that actually is the kind of guy he is, which is why he's a good manager right now with the Red Sox. He's somebody who Red Sox officials will still tell you, and this is an analytical team. They would tend to poo-poo the impact of a manager on games. Generally, these kind of teams, they say, no, he's an impactful manager because these players know that he cares about them. You know how rare that is in this business, to truly care about another human being within a professional sports team. It's very self-oriented business, as maybe most are. I don't know. Maybe that's human nature. But Cora really cares. He was like that all through his playing career. And he was a baseball junkie. Peter Gammons, the Hall of Fame writer, told me that back in the mid-aughts, when Cora was a bench player in the Red Sox, he would gather with a rotating group of other kind of bench players like Kevin Cash, backup catcher, who's now the manager of the Rays, Mark Kotsay, the outfielder, and they would get together with Gammons, the writer, at like 2-3 o'clock in the afternoon in the home dugout and just talk baseball, like who is the best college player of all time, or stuff like that, like really deep dive stuff into the game, because that's what he loves. And like Beltran is so savvy at picking up on details that it's almost like, what are you going to do when you see what the sign is? Not take it. And that's kind of where they were. I'm not excusing it, but I'm explaining their mindset, I think, going into this. And Cora, by the way, last played in spring training in 2011, goes to ESPN as a broadcaster for several years, is not back in the clubhouse in uniform until 2017, which is a totally different era technologically. So it's like his eyes are popping out of his head. It's like high-speed camera, live feed. I mean, it's like a new world. So I think in his defense, in a sense, it wasn't clear right away what you could do and what you couldn't do with these new toys.
And AJ Hinch, the former Astros manager, also just kind of like a really fascinating journey, I think, for him, right? I mean, it's, I think a lot of us that, like, I remember initially, like when he got hired, I was thinking, oh, they went to, right, or I guess when the D-backs first hired him, it was like,
Yeah.
okay, well, they hired this kind of failed player.
Yeah.
But he actually had like a very celebrated amateur career that I
Yeah.
think kind of like affected his psychology and how he processed maybe his professional career, and in turn affected the manager he became. How do you think, again, that whole journey, played into the part that he wound up playing in this whole drama?
That's right. Psychologically, it was very complex and up and down for him. It's interesting because even good friends of his through the years who talked to me for this book to help me understand him described a guy who was really up and down. In 1994, he beat out Derek Jeter as the Gatorade High School Player of the Year in all of America. So this guy's going to be a superstar. Starting catcher at Stanford. He actually has a pretty good career at Stanford, but by the end of it, it's like that imperceptible thing where your draft stock drops a little. He is a major league player. He's okay backup catcher for several years. That's farther than most players get. But by the end of his career, it fizzled out. He's in AAA in his early 30s. And that is a disappointment for him. It weighs on him. He has an ego and he has an intellect and he has an altruistic side too, where he was very good at talking to players. He became a player development executive with the Diamondbacks, helping with their minor leaguers. And as you said, he was hired 35 years old, no coaching or managerial experience, hired by Josh Burns, now with the Dodgers, who was the GM at the time in Arizona, because he thought Hinch could be a special manager. And he was right in many respects. He's an empathic person who, like the other people we're talking about, loved the game, was good at relating to people. But I think he had an insecurity too that drove him to be a bit conflict averse. First, with the Diamondbacks, they wanted Kirk Gibson to be the manager. He was a candidate as well. The players were not ready for a 35-year-old former college catcher who'd never been in the big leagues as a coach to be their manager. Players are showing him up in the dugout in full view. In the clubhouse, it's even worse. And it doesn't work out. Josh Burns is wrong. It wasn't a fit. And they both get fired a year later because of that hire. So Hinch this changes his whole life. He wanted to be a GM, and everyone's telling him, you're going to be a GM. He's a Stanford guy. You're not going to be in uniform anymore. You're going to be the khakis and polo guy, the GM. And now his ego and his ambition is such where he's like, I need to be a successful manager because I failed once. Jeff Lunau gives him the shot in 2015 in Houston. They have a great team. Hinch is doing a nice job implementing the analytics and blending that with the field side and being a good field person for that kind of front office. But when Beltran and Cora get there with their own ideas about this sign stealing scheme, Hinch just can't handle it. He says he doesn't like it. The sign stealing, he doesn't raise a concern. He and Cora have these weird fights where they're calling each other names on the team bus. It's tense, but it's not. They're talking around, I think, what was probably the central conflict between them. And Hinch just ended up faulting himself, and probably still faults himself, I would guess, for allowing the team to go in a direction that he says he felt was wrong. And I think that trails back to this, you call it a failed amateur player in a sense, or a failed professional athlete with the promise that he held, just wanting to be successful so much that you're willing to let things go in order to let that happen. Hey, you can win the World Series this way. And I think that's where he really failed.
And since all this has come out, obviously I've heard from players, and I'm sure, and obviously, and you describe this in your book too, the level of paranoia that existed at the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Since then, again, I've heard even like going into that World Series, right? There, somebody told me, maybe they have microphones like in the dugout or something, right? Like
Yeah.
it was kind of crazy. And I think you described a playoff series between Houston and Tampa, where Tampa was so paranoid that
Yeah.
maybe it even kind of affected the way they played.
Yeah.
You mentioned the was it DeGrom, I believe, or Syndergaard? One
Yeah,
of those.
Jacob DeGrom and
Yeah.
Brody Van Wagenen. That's right.
Right, at
Personally,
Dodger Stadium.
at Dodger Stadium. They personally inspected Dodger Stadium for a hidden camera in 2019. They thought that the Dodgers had DeGrom and the closer Edwin Diaz's signs one night because of the comfort of the swings, and they were looking for the camera. They didn't find anything out of the ordinary, but that's the level of paranoia that you say, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like the basis of all this, right? It comes down, like you said, the comfort of the swings, like right, people that do something for a living. I think
Yeah.
like when something's not quite right,
That's
right?
Like we know when we read a story if it seems not on the level, the reporting.
Correct.
And it's probably the same feeling. It's actually,
right. Yeah,
when you do something.
Right. I mean, so do you think, kind of as we go forward from here that we might be finding out things that happened here? How comfortable are you at this point that this was kind of the extent of it, right? Because I know we spoke earlier about just kind of how, I mean, people were like legitimately outraged, right? And I think it would be very hard to kind of like, knowing some of these people. Okay, there's no way Player X is that good of an actor that he's going to sit in front of his locker room and just like explode.
Yeah. I mean, Player X being, in this case, Cody Bellinger's anger at the Astros publicly, you name him because he said it, he was on TV. It was like, either you're an Oscar-winning actor or you're really mad. And I would tend to think it was the latter.
Right.
I think look, the Dodgers and the Yankees are two teams where it's just, there's this lingering, a lot of Astros fans are like, what about? And those are the two teams that come up all the time. So I felt like I had to investigate those teams as thoroughly, if not more thoroughly, than the Astros, in fairness to the Astros, especially the Yankees being in New York. And the last thing I could have was a book saying the Yankees weren't guilty of these terrible things at that level, and then it comes out that they were. Knock on wood. I still hope that doesn't happen one day because I wrote it the way I wrote it, where my reporting led me. But I don't think it will. I really don't. I'm quite confident that the Dodgers and Yankees were two teams that were technologically savvy, used their replay room, as has been, both teams have publicly acknowledged in different ways, to get sign sequences and signs, maybe got some sounds to the dugout or to runners on second base and things like that, but just didn't have this kind of culture, didn't have this kind of scheme that was designed in this way, and genuinely feel that the Astros got it wrong. Were you in spring training that day that Bellinger was?
I was not. No.
I'll bet that there was a visceral sense of anger because that very day I was at Yankees camp in Tampa, and Aaron Judge, Gleyber Torres, Gary Sanchez, none of these guys are outspoken people ever. And they were just really going off. Aaron Boone, the manager, said he didn't believe aspects of the commissioner's report, which was pretty extraordinary. I'm thinking the manager of the Yankees is saying he thinks this has gone further than the commissioner of the league is saying. These people meant it. And that really does tell you something. And we, like I said before, there's the gray area. The Yankees and the Dodgers were in it at times, but that's not what we're talking about here. I think more could come out about teams that I didn't sniff or see. Like I think I got a lot of it. I think anyone in our business that thinks they got 100% of any story is arrogant, right? We have to be humble about what we don't know. That's a big part of what our mindset has to be. But I think I got the feel of it, and a lot of paranoia, a lot of things going on. Astros worse. I'm confident in that construction, regardless of what comes out in the future, that I didn't get.
In regards to kind of the anger directed at the Astros, how much of this do you think is just like how they handle this in the aftermath? I'm going to go back to this Ethier story here. He says he's talking about the Astros here. They're saying everyone deserves a second chance. But in all these great second chances that they bring up in reference, all those people owned up to what they did and how they did it. Lance Armstrong said how he cheated. Alex Rodriguez said how he cheated. Tiger Woods said how he cheated. But these guys still haven't come out and said, yeah, we're doing this, we were doing that. They just said, yeah, we did something, but they're not saying how they did it. You keep seeing the denials. Oh no, we didn't do that though. Well, what did you do then? How much of that do you think, because, and I spoke to you, Darvish, also that spring, and that was kind of, and at the beginning he was kind of very, he kind of tried to take like a long, bigger kind of maybe non-Western approach to this thing, and said, well, I became the person I am now because of that experience, and
Americans don't want to hear that.
Yeah, I'm not going to. What actually upset him though was actually after Bellinger went off the next day, Correa sends a message to the media telling him shut the F up.
Yeah.
And that's when Darvish just kind of lost it. Like, well, what are you talking about? Like, you're not even sorry at that point.
That's right.
So how much, again, do you think that because I think that there is still kind of lingering anger, right? Maybe obviously it might have dissipated a little bit. Obviously it's turned in LA over here, it's turned Joe Kelly into a folk hero of sorts, which is like the weirdest thing, because before that he was like, one of Friedman's worst contracts. And it's arguably turned into like the best 28 million or whatever that he decided to light on fire.
How about that? Yeah.
But, again, how much of that do you think is just, the way the Astros have just kind of dealt with this, the aftermath?
Yeah, that's a good question. Quick detour on the Joe Kelly thing that you made me think of. That actually speaks to how beloved Alex Cora can be too, because Joe Kelly was just on the Red Sox before. He had nothing to do with, the Red Sox were doing some stuff to some extent, but his problem there, I had always understood, was that he felt that Astros players had thrown Cora under the bus. So he's mad for his friend that he loves, Alex Cora. I think that's what that was about, which is interesting. A little side note. Among possibly other factors, but I think that's part of it. I definitely think that their attitude was a major factor. When you have all these prominent players saying that they thought it was wrong, like in the same week, whether it's Judge and Torres or Bellinger or whoever, Bauer, when he was the Reds, spoke out at that same time. And the players we're listening, we're like, most players think this is wrong. So who am I to say it isn't? And then you got the Astros still in that defiant crouch. That did not help. We were around the game in clubhouses covering the game at that time. That really bothered opponents. I also think that one story about this that could still be told and probably can't be told until this team really breaks up, like in many years when there's no one left, is that I think that there were internal tensions around it that guys didn't feel like they could talk publicly about, and that created some of the weird energy. Some of those guys love Cora and Beltran, and some of those guys turned on Cora and Beltran to the MLB investigators and said it was their fault. They made me do it. The stories that came out about Beltran was the ringleader and the godfather that were overstated to an extent in tone, if not in fact. If you think that the guys who helped to get those stories out and the guys who love Beltran were in a different sides of that, and these are guys who might still be in the Astros clubhouse, right? So some of that energy, how like when someone's a jerk to you, you don't understand why, and you're like, oh, he had an argument with his family at home or something. I think there could be some of that going on. And again, this team has to fully break up, and this moment has to be further in the past before guys like Springer, Bregman, Altuve, Correa really speak openly. Someone will when they're older. But that to me is part of why they acted the way they acted, I think.
Now, the Dodgers in that World Series didn't just suspect them of stealing their signs, right? There was also something to do with maybe the baseballs. Could you get into that a little bit?
Actually changed an MLB rule, or procedure. This isn't the biggest deal in the world, but it's interesting to me that in the sign stealing World Series, something else got changed forever. And what it was the Dodgers had a player who got a hold of some balls that the Astros pitchers were throwing, brought him to the Dodgers, a Dodgers official, and said, look at this ball. It's too dark. It's way darker than any of the balls that our pitchers have. What's that about? And there's a process that's perfectly legal called mudding up the baseball. Every baseball that goes into a game gets mudded up, meaning just darkened with a little bit of mud or some mixture like that. This is not the sticky stuff that's in the news right now. This is just to get the baseball a little bit game ready. Usually a team employee like the clubhouse attendant does it in the umpire's room. The umpire is supposed to supervise. The umpire is probably usually eating a sandwich instead. It's a lax kind of process. The Astros had darker baseballs for their pitchers, and it was MLB took this seriously enough where the following season, as a direct result of this Dodger allegation, new posters appeared in every umpire's room. This is how a ball is supposed to look. This is too dark. And I asked someone at Major League Baseball, is that because of the Dodgers complaint? They said, yes, it is. That's why we changed that. So there you go.
And I thought like that and I actually referenced this in a column that I wrote about Trevor Bauer and kind of all the sticky stuff that's going on right now. Major League Baseball has kind of seemed to have taken this policy, this approach of quietly kind of policing the game, right? We're not going to try to create any kind of public scandal and try to settle things kind of quietly. I would argue that in this sign stealing case, it kind of blew up in their face.
Yep.
And here again with this, the sticky stuff, it has also now kind of spectacularly combusted in Manfred's face again.
Right.
What do you think of this approach that they've taken? And what are kind of do you think that there are any like alternative ways in handling stuff like this? Because I'm not really sure if, you know what I mean, like coming out.
Yeah, I don't know. I have some sympathy toward MLB on this one, in the sense that they're a company, they're a corporation, or whatever you want to call it. You're going to create your own scandal, or you're going to wait and hope the journalists don't do it for you, right? Now, however, you're right. There's a pattern of repeatedly being too slow to self-police so scandals happen. I think the sticky stuff thing, although definitely took too much time and a lot of people around the league are disgruntled the way it played out, they might have gotten out ahead of this before it blows up as spectacularly. Because really, what is the tentpole defining scandal of this? What's the book that someone might write about this? There isn't really that story yet, right? There isn't the McGuire-Sosa home run chase ruined by steroids. There isn't the Astros title tainted by cheating, sign stealing.
Well, they might have blown out an all-star caliber pitcher's arm.
I'd like to see the evidence.
Yeah. I'm with you on that.
That was a claim that was presented without evidence, is all I'll say about that. There's no, and frankly, I don't think this one has the hold on the public imagination quite the same anyway. And this is what I would use as a litmus test for that. I thought of this the other day when someone was grilling me on this. When you all found out that the Astros did what they did, it tainted their championship in your mind, in the imagination of the country. I'm not just, I know what y'all are going to say if you're Dodgers fans here, but take a step back from that even. If I told you today that every single Dodger pitcher was using spider tack last year, if I told the country that, I'm not saying that's the case, but if I said that in theory, would that taint their championship in the same way? Or would you just be like, okay, well, I guess that's 80% of pitchers were doing that. I just don't think it feels as scandalous to people. It doesn't have that that story behind it like some of these others.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't disagree with that either. One of the little anecdotes that I loved about this book was Bobby Valentine.
Yeah.
As he often does, pops up kind of unexpectedly in this book.
Does.
How could you kind of explain like his kind of
There's
part
a
of
Dodger
this
link to
saga?
this too. It's funny how Dodgery this book accidentally was. There's a whole chapter about Ralph Branca, and then the Bobby Valentine chapter, who, by the way, you talk about him popping up. Did you know that he's running for mayor of Stamford, Connecticut?
I did see that, yeah.
So, I mean, this guy doesn't stop. He invented the wrap sandwich in the 80s, he claims. So anyway, ballroom dancing champion. He was an innovator of using cameras to steal signs, and he admits it. He's open about it. It wasn't the same thing as the Astros, but it was a step forward in, if you wanted to use a camera to steal signs in the 60s, 70s, 80s, in the 90s, what you had to do was watch the TV broadcast. Literally put a TV in your clubhouse and try to get signs off of that. That's not zooming in on the catcher. You're dependent on the TV director doing that. So team-owned scouting cameras became a major innovation in sign stealing. Valentine, when he was a manager of the Mets in '97, the Mets had bought this scouting camera that had a little toggle switch that you could operate from the clubhouse where it could turn it. So he would turn it on the third base coach, look at the signs, and then he would stay in the ballpark until 4 o'clock in the morning with a life-size cutout of a human body, write numbers on each. Like the Dodgers third base coach goes nose, hat, nose, ear, and he's figuring out like what's that mean. This is a terribly inefficient system. He'd finally figure out the science at the end of a 3-game series sometimes, and then it was too late. So it didn't really work, but it was the first time that someone took high-tech cameras purchased by their team and tried to turn them into sign stealing. It was a precursor to what the Astros did. So yeah, that chapter, by the way, this has nothing to do with sign stealing, but begins with a very young Tommy Lasorda apparently literally teaching Bobby Valentine how to grow hair on his chest. You know, those two were like tight for the rest of their lives. But I think it's Ogden, Utah. Lasorda is the manager at the Dodgers affiliate. And young Bobby Valentine goes, Skip, I'm down. I don't have any hair on my chest, and I'm 18 years old, or whatever it was. And Lasorda goes, I don't know, eat the fat on steak. That'll grow hair on your chest. So Valentine comes back shirtless like weeks later. He's like, Skip, see, I did it. I grew hair on my chest. And sure enough, he had. And Lasorda's going, if this guy can will himself to grow hair in his own chest, he's going to do something in this game. I read that story in the Artful Dodger. That's like, you know, like the Lasorda's one. I'm sure he's written more than one memoir, but that was one of them. And then I confirmed it with Bobby Valentine when I was reporting this book. I was like, did that really happen? He goes, sure did. He taught me how to grow hair in my chest by eating the fat off of steaks. So there you go.
It's like one of those great little baseball stories, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, I think I saw you tweet something that this was a, you know, and I agree with it reading it, that it was kind of like a love letter, so to speak, to baseball, you know. And again, I'm sure there are Astros fans out there saying, right, you know, this guy just wanted to ruin my team or whatever.
Yeah,
but,
cash grab to throw my team under the bus. You know.
Yeah, but I really felt like that's the thing, that it captured kind of all those little things that we kind of like loved about, you know, what we like about the game. And I was wondering, you know, what were your, I guess, like favorite little things that you came across as you were,
yeah, that's a good question. And that
writing
is, those are learning sign sequences. Did you know, like, would you have known what those fingers mean? I mean, you know, one's a fastball and the basic thing of it, but learning, like, I had at one point, I work with Todd Zeal, the former Dodger, who came up as a catcher, and he's showing me, he's like, up, 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 up. He's doing all that stuff. And I'm like, I finally got it. I'm like, oh, that's chase 2, meaning literally you're going really fast, but the one you put down after 2 is the real sign. I'm like, curveball. He's like, yes, learning stuff like that. I know that's not a specific anecdote, but that level, that might be the answer. Like being able to ask those questions of baseball people that aren't relevant to our daily coverage. That's just not what we do. When you read so we're looking for news, we're covering the news of the day, we're analyzing, reporting on games, we're giving opinions, whatever it is. But from the press box, we're not learning that level of detail. So baseball's got this placid surface, which many even consider boring. And then you tune your eye sharper and you see everything that's happening in every single second. That was it. And that was the ongoing process of reporting. And it popped up in so many things, like someone at one point who had been in Dodger Town in the 70s told me that Maury Wills knew how to just had a tell on when pitchers were going to throw home. And that's one of the things that helped him steal so many bases. That's an example of to answer your question. Little moments like that, you're like, God, that detail would have died and been lost to history one day if someone had just told me that and I got it down on paper. So you feel like it's your privilege to do a service to people who love the game, to get a few things down on paper like that wouldn't have survived another 100 years if you didn't write it down, you know?
Yeah, and actually I wanted to take that as an opportunity to touch on one of the great practitioners, perhaps, of the dark arts, Chase Utley.
Yeah.
Was recently some baseball analyst, Ryan Spader, I guess, called him as one of the biggest cheaters. A couple days ago on Twitter. Kind of came back today, recanted a little bit. But I mean, you covered Utley in Philadelphia. You know him pretty well, I think.
Yeah.
Well,
as well as
again,
anyone can know that.
yeah,
Very
and
true.
again, like he's one of these characters that I think is right. He's really revered to the game, in the game. I mean, the Dodgers brought him here at the end of his career. I would argue, for the press, changed things for the worse.
I'm
Um,
sure he did. Yeah.
what was a very open, agreeable clubhouse. All of a sudden, everybody disappeared the next day because everybody wanted to be like Chase Utley.
Yep.
What again? What have you found about him, and what would you say again to somebody that calls him, quote, the biggest cheater of all time?
It's an interesting relevant because he was on those Dodger teams for several years, and he's currently in the Dodger front office. So this is a guy who's still very relevant in the game that had that accusation made about him publicly just a day ago. It's funny because what you describe about how much more difficult he made a reporter's job is absolutely true. But I don't dislike him for it because he's interesting. There's something about the guy. And as far as cheating goes, look, when I was covering the Phillies early in my career and he was a star on that team, he was always on the top step of the dugout squinting at the field. And there was actually a point reporting this book where I was like, now I know what Chase Utley was looking for. It's signs, it's tips, it's tells, it's all the details. He was great at that stuff. I guarantee you he helped Dodgers players figure that kind of stuff out. And I go back to the lack of evidence of the Dodgers going way far on this stuff. During those Utley years, they had technology and cameras and things that the Phillies didn't have when Utley was there. A different era in baseball. Would it surprise me if Chase Utley looked at a live feed of a camera to find sign sequences, tips, and tells? No, but you know what? Alex Rodriguez did that with the Yankees. Plenty of guys did it with the Red Sox. So everything we know about the Dodgers is that they were, again, in that gray area. And so you'd have to apply that to Utley too. And I'll also say that when you're accusing someone by name and not contacting them and giving them a chance to respond and reporting it out, that's a good thing. You apologize, but that's not, that was, you feel for Chase Utley. Maybe that's why he didn't like the media, because some of us pull stuff like that.
Yeah. Going back to a topic we touched a little bit earlier, kind of about the soul of the game, so to speak, right? And it's kind of this nebulous concept because I think it also goes into how the game itself is played, right? I was talking to a scout who does work in the Cal League, and he's saying, hey, you know what? Even if we fix this, and that, it's going to take a lot of time to kind of undo the damage because that's what they're teaching kids in A-ball now. There was a Dodgers Angels Class A game, 35 strikeouts between the two teams.
Wow.
Yeah. So, where do you think, is the soul of the game gone at this point? I mean, we know a lot of teams that have gotten wiped out entire scouting departments now.
Yeah.
Again, the game is kind of with the 3 true outcome thing now. Again, a lot of these kind of smaller details, I would argue, are kind of like disappearing, right?
Yeah. Yes.
I'm not even crazy, to be honest, about like the way replays being used. I like the
which I
neighborhood
agree
rule.
with.
It's kind of a, let the umpire decide, right?
Right. No, I agree.
Even with the strike zone, I like kind of whatever. This guy has got a different strike zone. It's kind of part of the game. Where do you think that is right now, and where do you think it's kind of headed? Because I think a lot of us that watch this game on a regular basis are kind of worried that, like, well, a lot of the things that I liked about it aren't around anymore.
I think, that's all true. The optimistic way to look at it is that what eras change and new traditions are replacing the old ones, and the people who have seen their way of life and the game changing are understandably unhappy about the change, but new things have come in. I'm not quite that optimistic because a lot of the things that I love that you just described are not in great shape. And I'm very concerned that there will be an extraordinarily ill-timed strike or lockout coming. Most people in the game kind of, I hate to say, take it as almost a given at this point that that's going to happen. Yeah. When baseball couldn't get it together on their labor situation during the worst of the pandemic last summer, that was threatening to lose people losing their patience with that strike right now. Look, nothing's a guarantee. Just because something's been around for 100 some years doesn't mean it'll be around forever. Everything impermanent, right? Not to sound non-Western myself, but it's all impermanent. So I think baseball has to work hard to keep its relevance, and some of this stuff is concerning. One of the things about Manfred's administration that I think has the potential to be good is that whatever his motivations, and if they're purely business, whatever, he seems to be just as scared about his product, and they're experimenting with radical changes to create more action in the game. Traditionalists won't like it, but I actually find that a little bit double-edged because they could bring back stolen bases. They could bring back more base hits and contact. I'm talking about things like outlawing the shift, defensive shifts, create more base hits, moving the mound back a foot, which traditionalists are like, there's not enough, there's too many strikeouts. And then I say, move the mound back a foot. They go, I'll never watch again. It's like, well, but that might help. There is a little bit of that. So Manfred's not going to take this one lying down. And I think that actually might end up helping.
All right. Well, we're coming up on an hour here. I'm not sure. Do you have any questions? Nobody wants to ask us anything? Diamond, ask something.
We have a plant in the crowd.
Yeah, we have a couple of plants here. We have a good friend Diamond Leung from The Athletic, and Chris Stone, my boss, is on.
Hi, Chris.
So,
well, this has been a fun conversation. Anyway, Dylan conducts a good interview. Chris, you got a good one here.
It's too bad you didn't do something. It's too bad you didn't do something bad. Then I become really good.
That's true. You can catch people and
yeah, I would have put the screws on you. Yeah,
that's true. Well, I know your tricks. I've been around you a few times. The first time we met, if you remember this, I was coming out to do a feature on Joe Torre's first year managing the Dodgers. So we've known each other a while.
Yeah. I actually remember that conversation too. So, all right.
Yeah, I want to leave space for folks to ask questions, but I also realize that it is 8:00 in the Pacific time zone, which means, Andy, if you are in fact joining us from New York, it's 11:00 your time. Okay, good. I was like, oh,
thanks, Chris.
Yeah, we've got a question from Chris. Andy, what was the catalyst for the book? The very first thing that made you say, I think there's a book here?
Now that's a good question. I happen to, this was a result of the grind of daily coverage, which we have a love-hate relationship with because it takes over our lives, but it's how you have developed an understanding of things and how you find stuff out. And I was covering the ALCS Yankees Astros in 2019, and because I was there, I was able to break a story that in game one of that series, the Yankees dugout erupted in anger over the Astros whistling to convey stolen signs. And it was like, we couldn't tell this from the press box, and it wasn't obvious on TV. So it took sourcing to tell me that this had happened. And it did happen. And MLB initially downplayed it. And the AJ Hinch went ballistic on my story at his press conference the next day, calling it a joke. And it became this big thing. But I knew it's just something about, when you got a good one. And I felt good about the story. I knew it had caused a reaction because it was true. And it was I think I felt on some gut level that it was a chance to learn about the game in the way that Dylan and I were talking about before. Like this game within the game, that even covering it every day from the height of the press box, you don't see. So as the winter went on, so the Athletic broke their story, and that was great job by them. And I was like, I know more of this. I know even more, and I could find out even more. So there was a momentum to it. And frankly, I wasn't thrilled that the Athletic had that story. I understand that they had great details, and I felt like I was leading the Astros thing. And now I'm behind them. So there's a little bit of that. And there's some momentum to the competitiveness of it. And you just want to keep making calls on it. And to finish my long-winded answer to your question, I think I knew it was a book the week that the report came out. Jim Crane fires AJ Hinch and Jeff Luhnow. The next day, Alex Cora steps down, and then I'm in New York covering what are the Mets going to do with their manager, Carlos Beltran. That was like, okay, 3 major league managers, all of whom were really fascinating people, just lost their jobs. That's when I wanted to write the book, because I wanted to write about those 3 guys. So it was that week that it was cemented in my mind as this is more than a daily story to break news on. This is a narrative.
Do you think Beltran ever manages?
I don't know. It's tough. I think he could work his way back, but what's tough for him is obviously Hinch and Cora had the championship track record already. They'd been able to develop that, so they were desirable candidates. Beltran wasn't. He was already a risk for the Mets. He had interviewed for the Yankees managerial job when Boone got it, and the Yankees really felt that he was a long way from being a manager. They hired him as a special assistant, and he was good at that, but they didn't love his interview. They're just like, yeah, he knows hitting and he's a great guy, but I'm not sure he's managed the whole game. They weren't getting that off of him. The Mets had this very strange period where a prominent agent, Brody Van Wagenen, was their GM. Ownership was on the way out. They knew it at the time before we knew it, that they were going to sell the team. It was kind of like throw that against the wall. Beltran was a very complicated guy in New York because he was a great free agent signing for them, but he was remembered for taking a strike 3 that ended a postseason series in 2006. So he wanted to redeem himself there, and the Mets were interested in the storyline. Just so many reasons he got that job. I think he could be a hitting coach anywhere tomorrow. It's not like he's got this scarlet letter on him. I mean, Mark McGwire has been a hitting coach, and so has Barry Bonds. But he's made so much money. He was going to be a manager. Does he want to work his way back in? I think he would have to climb a ladder a little bit. I'm not sure if he would do that. Diamond's got a question. The plants are coming through.
Yeah. How much has the Astros story / fallout been a deterrent at all to similar dark arts continuing?
I think it has. I really think it has. From a couple perspectives, Diamond, the technology perspective, the Wild West period of that stuff in the game, the high-speed cameras and no oversight, that is over. And they were actually cleaning that up gradually, too slow. But before this got out, it was harder to do this in 2019 than it was in 2017 because they had people in the replay rooms who would actually write you up. Some of these guys were on task, and some were like fans that were watching the game and not on task. But one replay guy told me that all he did was log into Slack real quick to message someone innocently, and he got written up for MLB for electronic communications during a game. So it was like no Slack during games. So there was none of that oversight. The Yankees actually ended up putting a wall up behind the replay guy so the players can't get to him during games. There's things that do make it harder. And then the second part of that is the public humiliation. I think it's pretty miserable enduring what these guys endured, even though they weren't disciplined. So I actually think that it will take another generation when this is forgotten for this to start cycling through again. I don't think we'll have another one of these like in the next couple of years.
I have a question that I've been wondering.
Sure.
Were there any people specifically with the Astros that were inept at this? They were bad at remembering the kind of signals that were being broadcast to indicate a stolen sign. Were there people that essentially had to be benched or cut because they couldn't keep up with all of the secret codes necessary?
Well, it may have been somewhat idiot proof, and then all you had to do was hear thunk and you knew that the changeup was coming. But it was it wasn't that I heard that some guys weren't good at it, but there are some guys who don't feel that they're good when they have the sign. David Wright, the former Met player who I covered for years, is always like this. He got the sign once early in his career, and it was wrong. Like the guy had it wrong, and he took an embarrassing swing. He's like, I never want the sign again. I just want to react to the pitch. Jose Altuve was one of those guys. He did not want it because whatever reason, maybe ethical, maybe that it clouded up his mind. I think my understanding is maybe more the latter, that he just wants to see ball, hit ball, which is a common thing. So he wasn't good at it. To your question, actually, he wasn't good at knowing the sign. And there were times, and it's funny, I wrote a detail that I heard through reporting that when the garbage can would bang during his at-bats, it was an accident, and he would glare angrily into the dugout, like, stop. And some Astros fan actually found a video of this the other day and put it on Twitter. I didn't know there was video. So it was interesting seeing video of something that I was told anecdotally, but that's true. It was like, I'm no good with that sign. Don't give it to me. And there were a couple of players, Altuve the most prominent, that were like that.
Yeah, because you even hear about stuff, right, with when the analytics people come down to the clubhouse.
Yeah, we don't
not
want
every player wants to know, like, hey, because they usually give you this data, like,
yeah.
80% of the time he's going to throw this at this count. And some guys just think, as long as my swing is right, that's all that matters. I don't want the other stuff, so.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, I have one more from Chris, and you're gonna have to forgive me if I butcher the pronunciation here. I'm guessing you're gonna say Lunau. Lunau?
Oh, Lunau, yeah.
Lunau.
Yeah.
Lunau.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard you say it all night, and yet still. But after Lunau, who is remembered in 20 years as the biggest villain in all this?
So you feel better about that? I had to Google the pronunciation before recording the audiobook to make sure I had it right. So it's a tough name. The biggest villain. I think he's the one that established the culture and acted in ways that were amoral, if not immoral. So he really does stick out. I really tried to write this, Chris, without judgment. Dylan and I were talking about this actually earlier today when we were prepping for this. Someone who's written columns for the newspaper for a long time and enjoyed it. One thing about that form that sometimes I didn't love was the inherently judgmental aspect of it. The good guys and the bad guys, the manager was right, the manager was wrong. It lends itself obviously to that form. What I liked about the book was I could tell you the guys that did it, Alex Cora and Carlos Beltran and George Springer and Utley Gurriel and all these players that cheated. But I was trying more to use the space to develop some empathy and understanding and not think in terms of villains, but in terms of like, how does that happen? And I think I could be, any of us could be in a bad culture and end up going along with that culture or doing things that we would later regret. So I don't see villains in this. Maybe Lunau because he does stick out, but that's my honest answer.
Well, I kind of wonder if it could be like Manfred.
That's interesting.
Right? Just as the guy that kind of oversaw. You look back at the steroid thing, right? I think the more time goes by, the more we see kind of fingers pointed like a ceiling. Hey, you knew something was going on. You were slow to react.
Yeah. Teams think that. Other teams started. There was like a group of teams, the Yankees, the Rays, the Indians, some teams, the Mariners, that would complain constantly to baseball and share intel with each other about the Astros because they didn't think that these investigations were taken seriously enough. MLB did investigate the Astros and other teams like almost a dozen times in a matter of a couple of years. So other teams are like, why isn't anything happening? So yeah, that's on Manfred's watch. It's a good point.
Yeah, and I think like a lot of time, and also you have this repetition thing now kind of with I'll say this, like I think the players, generally speaking, do a horrible job of PR.
Yeah.
The one area where I think they've done a good job is actually in regarding to the sticky stuff, right? They've managed to somehow flip this completely, ignore the fact that this rule's been on the books, you know? Hey, you weren't enforcing it, and everybody's kind of,
and now you're going to do it mid-season.
Right, now you're going to do it mid-season, and you were also the sign, right? You also let the sign stealing thing get, and it feels like there's a bit of an avalanche kind of going up against, that Manfred's getting rolled up in here.
Yeah, it's a good point. And Manfred lost the PR war to an extent last summer, too, when players are saying, tell us when to show up. We want to play. And Manfred was trying to cut their salary from the fully prorated. And I think the players surprisingly won a bit of the public didn't see them as greedy the way they presented it as they maybe did during the 94 strike.
Now, do you think, we kind of, I think I brought this up that somebody in the game that I spoke to brought this idea up that maybe, that Manfred's too much of a CEO, that maybe you need to split up the commissionership between have Manfred be the CEO, right? The guy kind of focused on being, on making money, and maybe appoint like a separate commissioner that actually oversees the interests of the game, because the two things sometimes are at odds with each other, right?
How would that work, though? I hear that, but isn't the business of baseball labor versus management? Manfred
right.
versus Clark or whoever's in those roles. I don't know. Or
say, I mean, for example,
So
say with the sticky stuff situation right now, right? Obviously, like one thing could be just develop like a new base, like an easier to grip baseball, right?
right.
Now that's going to cost money. And maybe they've gotten to a point where they'll go down that road at some point.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. I wonder
what
if
I
the fact that everything needs to be collectively bargained would make it
Right.
difficult for that person to have any power. I think ideally you'd have someone in that position who had a feel for the game, right?
Yeah.
Like Bud Selig wasn't popular, but there has been a comparison made. And I think Manfred does a better job in many ways than Selig does, actually. It's a whole other conversation. But I've heard people say to me justifiably, like Selig was whatever, but at least he loved the game, sort of pointedly. But yeah, I mean, that's that lack of field. Justin Turner and the whole piece of metal for the World Series trophy thing. That was a comment that really landed on Manfred and stuck because it exposed what felt like a lack of feel for the game.
Yeah.
This has been such a delight. I love talking about baseball, hearing about baseball. So I'm like, this was an excellent way to spend my Thursday evening. And I want to thank everybody who joined us to hear about Cheated, to hear about the Astros and their sign stealing. And I especially want to thank Dylan Hernandez for conducting such a great interview. And then, of course, Andy Martino for doing the research, writing the book, and joining us all here this evening. Thank you once again from everyone at Chevalier's. I put the link in the chat one more time, and you can find it on the Chevalier's website. And the video of this will be up on our YouTube channel pretty soon. And folks who weren't able to join us tonight, you can send them the link so that they too can learn so much more about what was happening in the Astros organization and all of MLB at the time. Thank you again. Have a great night.
Thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone who came. Thanks for the interest.
Thank you. It was
Thanks,
fun.
Dylan. Okay, bye-bye.